In the early hours of January 3, 2026, the world witnessed one of the most audacious military operations in recent American history. Under the cover of darkness, more than 150 aircraft launched from 20 different bases across the Western Hemisphere, converging on a single target in the heart of Caracas, Venezuela. The mission, codenamed Operation Absolute Resolve, would fundamentally reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Western Hemisphere and set in motion a chain of events that would bring the United States and Russia closer to direct confrontation than at any point since the Cold War. The operation had been months in the making. Since August, a small CIA unit had been operating covertly inside Venezuela, tracking the movements and habits of President Nicolás Maduro with extraordinary precision. They documented where he slept, what he ate, the names of his pets, and the daily rhythms of his heavily fortified compound. Meanwhile, the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group took up position in the Caribbean, part of a massive military buildup that President Donald Trump believed would force Maduro to capitulate without a fight. But despite the overwhelming show of force, despite a personal phone call from Trump himself urging surrender, Maduro made the fateful decision to stay. At 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time on January 2nd, Trump gave the final authorization. Weather had delayed the operation for days, forcing elite special forces to wait through the holidays as storms lashed the Venezuelan coast. But that Friday night, the weather broke just enough to create a narrow window of opportunity. Helicopters launched from their carriers, flying at 100 feet above the water to avoid radar detection. Above them, an armada of protective aircraft maintained overwatch. F-22 and F-35 fighters, B-1 and B-2 bombers, remotely piloted drones, and an array of support craft that represented the full spectrum of American air power. As the helicopters approached shore, the United States unleashed both kinetic and non-kinetic effects against Venezuelan defenses. Cyber operations and space-based capabilities disabled air defense systems across northern Venezuela. Precision strikes hammered infrastructure at La Guaira Port and Higuerot Airport, destroying surface-to-air missile batteries and aircraft that might have threatened the extraction force. The lights of Caracas flickered and died as American forces methodically dismantled Venezuela's ability to respond. By 1:01 a.m., the helicopters were over Maduro's compound in downtown Caracas. What happened next unfolded with surgical precision. Delta Force operators descended into the compound and moved with speed toward their objective. Trump, watching live feeds from a specially configured room at Mar-a-Lago, later described seeing Maduro attempt to flee to his reinforced safe room as American troops closed in. The Venezuelan leader and his wife Celia Flores were taken into custody without loss of American life, though there were multiple defensive engagements as the extraction force withdrew. One helicopter was struck by ground fire but managed to continue flying. By 3:29 a.m., the force was back over water. By 4:30 a.m., Maduro was aboard the USS Iwo Jima, blindfolded and wearing a gray tracksuit, beginning his journey to New York to face narcoterrorism charges. The operation came at a cost. Venezuelan Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello would later announce that 100 people were killed during the strikes, with a similar number injured. Cuba revealed that 32 of its citizens, military and intelligence personnel operating in Venezuela, died in the operation. 7 American service members were wounded, with 2 still recovering days later. But from a military perspective, Operation Absolute Resolve was a stunning success. The United States had reached into the capital of a sovereign nation, extracted its leader, and returned to international waters in a matter of hours. The immediate aftermath saw Venezuela plunge into political uncertainty. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was designated acting president by the Venezuelan Supreme Court, but opposition leader Maria Corina Machado called for Juan Guaido to be recognized as the legitimate president. Trump made clear that the United States now considered itself in control of Venezuela's future, stating that America would run the country until a new leader could be chosen. The president did not rule out a continued American military presence, ominously noting that there had been boots on the ground that night and there could be again. But Operation Absolute Resolve was only the beginning of a broader campaign. Since mid-December, the United States had been enforcing what Trump called a blockade of sanctioned oil tankers traveling to and from Venezuela. The operation, designated Southern Spear, aimed to strangle Venezuela's ability to export oil and generate revenue. On December 10th, American forces had seized their first target, the oil tanker Skipper, intercepted shortly after leaving Venezuelan waters by Marines and Coast Guard personnel launching from the Gerald R. Ford. The Skipper had been part of what analysts call a shadow fleet, vessels that falsify their locations and registrations to evade sanctions while transporting oil from Iran, Venezuela, and Russia. After Maduro's capture, the pressure intensified dramatically. At least 16 tankers fled Venezuelan ports on January 5th, attempting to overwhelm the American quarantine by scattering in different directions simultaneously. They transmitted false names and positions, turned off their identification transponders, and employed every evasion tactic available, but the United States was watching. Among those vessels was one that would become the center of an international crisis, the Bella 1, a rust-streaked tanker that had been sanctioned in 2024 for operating within Iran's shadow fleet. The Bella 1 had been attempting to reach Venezuela to load oil when the Coast Guard cutter Monroe intercepted it on December 20th. The vessel's crew refused to allow American personnel to board. Instead of complying with the Coast Guard's orders, the tanker made an abrupt turn into the Atlantic Ocean and began running. What followed was a chase that would stretch across thousands of miles of open ocean and last for more than 2 weeks. As the Bella 1 fled eastward, its crew took increasingly desperate measures. They painted a Russian flag on the hull. They changed the ship's name to Marinera. On December 24th, they obtained temporary registration under the Russian flag, a move that dramatically complicated the legal and diplomatic dimensions of any seizure. By early January, the Marinera had crossed the Atlantic and was transiting between Iceland and Scotland, possibly heading for a Russian Arctic port. American officials tracked every movement. The Coast Guard cutter Monroe maintained pursuit across treacherous winter seas, through storms that would have deterred lesser crews. Intelligence agencies monitored communications and satellite data, and in response to the Marinera's new Russian registration, Moscow deployed naval assets to escort the tanker. A Russian submarine and surface vessels took up positions near the Marinera, creating the potential for a direct military confrontation between American and Russian forces. The situation reached its climax on January 7th. In a pre-dawn operation coordinated between the Coast Guard, Navy SEALs, and the Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, American forces moved to seize the Marinera. Helicopters carrying special operators launched from nearby vessels and converged on the tanker in international waters within Iceland's exclusive economic zone. The boarding was executed without incident, with the tanker's crew offering no resistance as heavily armed American personnel took control. Video released by the Coast Guard showed the Marinera being escorted by American vessels through cold Atlantic waters, a Russian flag still visible on its rust-stained hull. Simultaneously, a second operation was underway in the Caribbean. The oil tanker Sophia, carrying approximately 2 million barrels of Venezuelan crude loaded in late December, was intercepted by American forces in international waters. Unlike the empty Marinera, the Sophia represented a significant prize, not just the vessel itself, but its entire cargo of sanctioned oil. Both ships were declared stateless by American authorities, who argued that their flags were false and their registrations illegitimate. Both were now being escorted to the United States for what officials termed final disposition. Russia's response was immediate and furious. The Foreign Ministry issued formal protests, declaring that the seizure violated the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and constituted an act of piracy. The Ministry of Transport insisted that the Marinera had been properly registered under Russian law, and that no state had the right to use force against vessels lawfully flying another country's flag. But it was the reaction from Russia's legislature that sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles and raised the specter of military escalation. Alexei Zhuravlev, first deputy chairman of the State Duma Defense Committee and a senior member of Russian parliament, issued a statement that went far beyond typical diplomatic condemnation. Speaking on Telegram, Zhuravlev characterized the seizure as outright piracy and equated it to a direct attack on Russian territory. He argued that because the tanker was flying the Russian flag, the American action constituted a violation of Russian sovereignty that demanded a harsh and swift response. Then he went further, explicitly calling for military retaliation. According to Zhuravlev, Russia should respond by attacking with torpedoes and sinking American Coast Guard vessels involved in the operation. He suggested this was the only way to stop the United States, which he accused of operating in a state of euphoria and impunity following the Venezuelan operation. He noted that Russian military vessels, including a submarine, had been in the vicinity of the Marinera during the seizure, implying that Russia had the capability to carry out such attacks. And in language that invoked the most dangerous dimensions of great power conflict, he referenced Russia's military doctrine regarding the use of nuclear weapons. Zhuravlev's statement asserted that Russian military doctrine allows for nuclear weapons to be employed in response to attacks on national interests. While it remained unclear whether these were the views of a single provocative lawmaker or reflected broader thinking within the Russian government, the implications were chilling. The seizure of a single oil tanker had prompted a Russian parliamentarian to publicly advocate for sinking American ships and to invoke the possibility of nuclear escalation. Whether rhetoric or genuine threat, the words underscored how quickly events in the Atlantic could spiral into something far more dangerous. The White House response was characteristically defiant. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt dismissed concerns about conflict with Russia, emphasizing that the Marinera was a Venezuelan shadow fleet vessel deemed stateless after flying a false flag. She noted that a judicial seizure warrant had been issued and that the crew would face prosecution. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth took to social media to declare that the blockade of sanctioned Venezuelan oil remained in full effect anywhere in the world. The message was unmistakable. The United States would not be deterred by Russian objections or threats. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, speaking to reporters on Capitol Hill, revealed that the Trump administration was negotiating a deal to take control of Venezuela's oil exports indefinitely. He described the tremendous leverage and control the United States now wielded over Venezuela's oil industry, suggesting that acting President Rodriguez was cooperating and understood that economic survival depended on working with Washington. Rubio indicated that Venezuela wanted the oil seized aboard the Sophia to be part of this arrangement. Trump himself announced that Venezuela would hand over 30 to 50 million barrels of oil to the United States, with proceeds controlled by Washington and intended to benefit both countries. The seizures had immediate effects on Venezuela's oil trade. Ships that would normally load crude at Venezuelan ports remained at anchor, their owners fearful of American interception. Tracking data showed vessels switching off their identification systems or transmitting false positions, tactics that might delay detection, but would ultimately prove futile against the surveillance capabilities the United States had arrayed across the Caribbean and Atlantic. The Trump administration had effectively placed Venezuela's oil industry under American oversight, using military force to enforce an economic stranglehold that went far beyond traditional sanctions. International reaction was mixed and largely divided along predictable lines. Russia and China condemned the operations as violations of international law and sovereign state rights. Iran called for Maduro's release, with a foreign ministry spokesman declaring that the abduction of a president and his wife was nothing to be proud of and demanding their return. Latin American nations were split, with some supporting Venezuelan sovereignty while others, particularly those opposed to Maduro, welcomed the American intervention. The United Nations Security Council was convened at Venezuela's request, though any meaningful resolution faced certain veto from the United States. In the United States itself, the operation sparked intense debate. Some members of Congress, particularly Democrats, accused the administration of lying about its intentions during classified briefings. Senator Andy Kim of New Jersey stated that administration officials had looked senators in the eye weeks earlier and insisted the campaign was not about regime change, a claim now proven false. Others raised constitutional questions about whether the president had the authority to order military action in Venezuela without congressional approval. The Senate voted 52-47 to pass a war powers resolution limiting Trump's ability to send troops to invade Venezuela, though the resolution's practical effect remained unclear. Among Trump's base and many Republicans, however, the operations were celebrated as decisive actions that demonstrated American strength and resolve. Supporters argued that Maduro was a narco-terrorist who deserved to face justice, that Venezuela's oil should not fund corruption and drug trafficking, and that the United States had both the right and the responsibility to intervene. The debate reflected deeper divisions about American foreign policy, the limits of presidential power, and the proper role of military force in pursuing national interests. As the Marinera and Sophia made their way toward American ports under armed escort, questions multiplied about what would happen next. Would Russia actually follow through on Zhuravlev's threats, or were his words merely bluster designed for domestic consumption? Would China, a major purchaser of Venezuelan oil, take concrete steps to challenge American control over Venezuela's energy exports? Would the Venezuelan military, still largely intact despite the loss of Maduro, accept American oversight or mount resistance? And would the Trump administration, having achieved a stunning tactical success, find itself drawn into a long-term occupation that could become politically and militarily costly? The British government confirmed it had provided support for the Marinera seizure, including use of air bases and the deployment of the replenishment vessel, RFA Tideforce and RAF surveillance aircraft. Defense Secretary John Healey described the tanker as part of Shadow Fleet activity linked to a Russian-Iranian axis of sanctions, evasion fueling terrorism, and conflict from the Middle East to Ukraine. The involvement of America's closest ally demonstrated that this was not a unilateral operation, but one conducted with at least some international support, even if that support came primarily from nations already aligned with Washington's broader strategic objectives. The human dimension of these events remained largely hidden from public view. Venezuelan civilians described the terror of American strikes, with explosions powerful enough to destroy homes and send families fleeing into the night. The families of the 100 Venezuelans and 32 Cubans killed in Operation Absolute Resolve mourned their dead at funerals that became rallies against American intervention. The crews of the seized tankers, many of them low-wage maritime workers from developing nations, found themselves caught between great power politics, facing possible criminal prosecution for following orders from their employers. And in New York, Maduro and his wife sat in a federal detention facility, the first time in modern history that a sitting head of state had been forcibly extracted from his country by a foreign military and brought to trial. The broader implications of Operation Absolute Resolve and the tanker seizures extended far beyond Venezuela and the Atlantic shipping lanes. The operations represented a dramatic assertion of American willingness to use military force to enforce its interpretation of international law and national interests. They demonstrated capabilities that worried adversaries and allies alike, the ability to reach anywhere, strike with precision, and extract targets despite significant defenses. At They also raised fundamental questions about international norms, the rules governing maritime commerce, and the risks of escalation when great powers clash over resources and influence. For Russia, already struggling with its prolonged military campaign in Ukraine, the seizure of a Russian-flagged vessel presented a dilemma. Failing to respond risked appearing weak and emboldening further American actions. But responding militarily risked a confrontation that Russia could ill afford while committed to operations in Eastern Europe. Zhuravlev's inflammatory rhetoric might have been designed to rally domestic support and warn Washington without committing Moscow to actions it had no intention of taking. Yet the very existence of such threats, the invocation of nuclear doctrine over a tanker seizure, illustrated how quickly incidents at sea could become catalysts for wider conflict. As this crisis continues to unfold, the world watches to see whether the Trump administration's gamble will pay off, or whether the audacious operations that began on that dark January night will draw the United States into exactly the kind of prolonged foreign entanglement that many Americans hope to avoid. The seizure of the Marinera and Sophia, coming just days after Operation Absolute Resolve, has created a new reality in the Western Hemisphere, where American military power shapes events in ways not seen since the height of the Cold War. Whether this represents a temporary disruption or a fundamental shift in how the United States pursues its interests in Latin America and beyond remains to be seen.